Rachel L. Swarns covers immigration issues in Washington and across the country for the New York Times. Since joining the Times Washington Bureau in March 2003, she's written about the heated battle in Congress over immigration legislation, Bush administration policy towards Muslim immigrants after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and about how Mexican immigration is transforming small towns in the South. In fact, she has a deadline tonight on a story on that very subject, so she's working under deadline and under other pressures as well. Between September 1999 and February 2003, she served as the Times Johannesburg bureau chief, covering 11 countries in South Africa, in Southern Africa, I'm sorry. She joined the New York Times in December 1995, where she served as a general assignment reporter for the Metro Desk, covered social services, including welfare reform and foster care in New York City, the aftermath of the TWA Flight 800 crash, and stints on the 1996 presidential campaign. She covered homelessness and health care in Russia in 1996 and the Pope's visit to Cuba in 1997. Before joining the Times, Ms. Swarns was a reporter at the Miami Herald from 1991 to 1995, covering immigration, housing, federal courts, and general assignments. Before that, she was with the St. Petersburg Times from 1989 to 1991, covering criminal courts. Born in Queens, New York on July 10, 1967, Ms. Swarns received a BA degree in Spanish, graduating summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa from Howard University in Washington, D.C. in 1989, and an MA degree, graduating with distinction in international relations from the University of Kent in Canterbury, England in 1994. It is with great pleasure, please join me in welcoming Ms. Rachel Swarns.
I hope everyone can hear me. I'm a little shorter than he is. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. As he's kindly mentioned, my name is Rachel Swarns. Policy topics in the country right now, and a topic that I'm sure everyone has heard a little something about. You may have heard about the President giving his prime-time address earlier this year about sending the National Guard to the border with Mexico, and about the fierce legislative battles in Congress. And you may have also heard about some of the legislative stalemate over some of the more contentious issues in Congress right now, such as what to do with the 11 to 12 million illegal immigrants believed to be living in the country, and how to create a guest worker program to address future flows of foreign workers. What we haven't heard as much about, though, is why this issue is boiling right now, what is behind the issue, and kind of what's driving it at the ground level. As a reporter, some of my most satisfying work examines the story behind the story. In this case, looking at some of the underlying factors behind an issue like immigration, the backstory, if you will. So today I'm going to be talking a lot about the backstory in the immigration issue and the stories that I cover, and then a little bit about my own backstory so you have a sense of who I am and how I came to be where I am right now. So what is the backstory here, and what is really driving this debate on immigration that has become the top of the evening news, the forefront in Congress, the front pages of many of our national newspapers? Some of this has to do with the President, who decided to take on this issue in a very public way, calling for the legalization of illegal immigrants. But a lot of this has less to do with what is going on in Washington, where I work, and more to do with what is happening around the country in places like Utah. We are currently experiencing one of the biggest waves of immigration that this country has ever seen. Now, everyone knows that we're a nation of immigrants, and when we think about mass migration to the United States, we often think about the early 1900s and the ships pulling into New York City and immigrants pouring into Ellis Island and New York. And the industrializing Midwest. And often, we've read all about that in our history books, and we're all pretty familiar with those stories, but it often seems very far away, a bit remote perhaps, a bit unimaginable, except that you and I are living through one of those times right here and right now. Today, the country has more than 33 million foreign-born residents, and that is the largest number since 1850, when the census started keeping statistics. In 2003, foreign-born residents made up 12% of the population, the highest percentage since 1910. More immigrants are arriving in the United States today, now, than when the crowded ships were coming to New York City in the early 1900s. Well, what is different this time? Well, one thing that's different is that the newcomers, many of them illegal, and the whole question of illegal status was not a problem that the Europeans had to deal with very often when they were coming in the 1900s. But many of these folks are going now to places far beyond the traditional immigrant settlement grounds, settlement states, where people mostly went. And I'm talking, when I talk about this period of mass migration that we're experiencing, I'm talking about between 1990 and today, basically the past 16 years. So over the past 16 years, we've seen people moving far beyond the cities in the Northeast, in the Southwest, in California, Chicago, Florida. We're now seeing people pouring into places in the South, in the Plain States, in places where people haven't seen waves of immigrants for generations, some places for more than 100 years. Well, what does this mean? The census released some interesting statistics a few weeks back comparing 2000 to 2005. And you see this kind of growth in very interesting places. Indiana, not known as a very big settlement ground for immigrants, saw a 34% increase in foreign-born residents between 2000 and 2005. South Dakota, 44%. Delaware, 32%. Missouri, 31%. Colorado, 28%. New Hampshire, 26%. Utah, 24%. And in the southern states, one of the regions most affected by the surge in immigration, between 1990 and 2005, the number of Hispanics quadrupled. The other difference that we're seeing in this wave of immigration compared to the previous one is who's coming. In the early 1900s, the new arrivals were overwhelmingly European. Today, they are overwhelmingly Latin American, with the single biggest share coming from Mexico, and with good numbers coming from Asia and from Africa as well. And we are literally seeing these changes right before our eyes. Now, I was born and raised in New York City, as you know, a place that is used to an enormous diversity of immigrants, but even there, I saw it happening. I worked in Florida for 6 years, and I moved back to New York City to join the Times in 1995, which was really the beginning of the height of these new flows of immigration. And in New York City, we have a large Hispanic population, mostly Caribbean, so folks from the Dominican Republic, Cuba, American citizens from Puerto Rico. But what I saw in the mid-1990s, all of a sudden, were Mexicans on the subways, on the trains, and everywhere. And this was a population that you just didn't see when I was growing up. And so this is the kind of thing that's happening everywhere and pushing the debate into the state legislatures and into Washington. A bit of the underlying, the backstory, as I mentioned, behind this kind of boiling debate. Well, how does this change on the ground, and what does this mean for places on the ground? I've given you some national statistics. I've given you some state statistics. But as I mentioned, I like peeling as much behind the layers, much of the layers as I can, to get behind the story as much as I can. And so one of the things I was really interested in is on a very micro level, at the very ground level, what happens to a community? How does a community change when you have this kind of very rapid transformation? And so over the past 6 months, I've been spending a lot of time in the South, one of the regions that I told you is most changing most rapidly. And in particular, I've been spending time in Atkinson County, Georgia, which is in south-central Georgia, a very small community of about 7,000 people, about 2 hours' drive from Jacksonville, and a community that has been utterly transformed by immigration. In 1990, Atkinson County had a population that was 3% Hispanic. By 2004, it was 21% Hispanic. And folks in Atkinson, the county officials believe that that's actually an undercount, because even though the census counts both legal and illegal immigrants, it's often difficult to count illegal immigrants. So they believe that probably about 30 to 35% of the population in this little county is now Hispanic. Hispanics now outnumber blacks, who make up about 19% of the population, and whites, according to the census, are about 60%. So what does this mean? Well, it means that in Atkinson County, the one supermarket, the one big supermarket that they have, a place called Harvey's, which in the early 1990s didn't even sell tortillas, now has 3 aisles dedicated to Hispanic specialty foods. Mole, cilantro, whatever you're looking for, you can find there. And this is because about 40 to 50% of the supermarket's customers are now Hispanic. Down the road at the used car dealership, Guthrie's, about 60% of the customers there are Hispanic. At the local barber shop, the barber told me that about a third of the men who sit in his chair are Hispanic. A karate school opened 2 years ago that caters almost entirely to the children of Mexican workers who are now prosperous enough to pay for classes. And this spring, a Catholic church in a neighboring county opened a brand new building simply and purely to accommodate the Spanish language Mass. Now, the Catholic faith is not, among the biggest faiths in the South, but it has been bursting at the seams, literally, along with this Mexican immigration. And many of the folks in the county that I was writing about attend this church. And many of the new immigrants who have arrived in Atkinson County were among those you may have seen on television in the spring, marching in some of the rallies around the country, calling for the legalization of illegal immigrants. And here at this ground level, you can see very clearly some of the divisions that we see on the national level, and it helps you understand a little bit about why those divisions are in place. In Atkinson, as you might imagine, the business community, which has seen many of its clients, increasingly larger numbers of its clients are Hispanic, and its workforces are increasingly Hispanic. This business community is very, very much in favor of laws that would legalize illegal immigrants, and very, very much in favor of them. On the other hand, you have folks who have been living in this community for a long time who are very, very upset about the changes there. And I forgot to mention earlier, Atkinson had been pretty much a black-white community, like many communities in the South, for generations. The last big wave of immigration to this town was like in the 1850s and 60s, when Irish workers came to try and complete a railroad project, which ultimately collapsed, but those folks settled there. So really, they had not seen newcomers, foreigners in this place for over 100 years. And so for some people, this kind of change has been too quick, too fast, changing their way of life in ways that people are very uncomfortable with. People are also very concerned about footing the bill for some newcomers, particularly those who are illegal. Illegal immigrants who are students in schools, illegal immigrants who are receiving subsidized health care. And so you see quite a decided split in this community. And this kind of split is the same kind of split that we're seeing on the national level, where the large chambers of commerce around the country are among the biggest and most powerful lobbies in support of some of the changes that the president has called for in granting legal status to illegal immigrants, while on the other hand you have another wing of the Republican Party feeling equally as strongly that these illegal immigrants are lawbreakers and folks who shouldn't be rewarded. And so this kind of demographic shift in the towns where you and I live and work and study and go to church is one of the things that's driving this debate in Washington. And so now a little bit back to Washington. Part of what I do, I told you I kind of like peeling back the layers a lot. But part of what I do is just kind of the business of the news in Washington. And with immigration, that has been centered very much in the past year on Congress. So I spend a lot of time in the Capitol, listening to hearings, legislative debates, wrangling over policy, pouring through dense and sometimes not enormously interesting legislation, interviewing key senators and congressmen. But again, wherever I can and wherever I have the opportunity, I try and look for the backstory. And a good example of the kind of backstory that I've been able to find in Washington is in the spring I wrote a piece about some of the Republicans who were most influential in this debate, and found out that some of those who were most active in supporting legalization or a guest worker program were actually people who were either the children of immigrants themselves or had very close ties to that experience. So they were people who had a direct connection to the immigrant experience, and that experience shaped their worldview and their view on this legislation. People like Senator Arlen Specter of Pennsylvania, who was a child of Russian immigrants who sold melons out of the back of a pickup truck and ran a junkyard to make ends meet. Senator John Kyle of Arizona said he grew up listening to the stories of his grandparents, who came from the Netherlands around 1910. Senator Mel Martinez of Florida, an immigrant himself, who fled Cuba for Florida in 1962 when he was 15. And Senator Pete Domenici of New Mexico, who was actually the son of an illegal immigrant from Italy. And he watched his mother taken away by the federal authorities when he was 9 or 10 years old. And it was actually a very, very powerful moment. You know, sometimes these legislative debates kind of go on and on and on, and everyone talks and talks and talks. And we were in the beginning of one of these long ones when Pete Domenici stood up and said, you know, my mother was an illegal immigrant. And kind of, I certainly turned around because, you know, I mentioned that the whole issue of illegal status is relatively new. And certainly when we think of illegal immigrants these days, we don't think of illegal immigrants from Italy. But this was at the time, it was during the Second World War, and at a time when the United States had great concerns about Italy and Italian Americans because we were at war with Italy. And his mother, who was a PTA member and very active in her community, just didn't have her papers in order. And so she was taken away. Ultimately, the situation was resolved, but it really shaped his view. And though that kind of backstory was one of the ways the Times was able to distinguish itself in kind of telling the story of this immigration debate raging in Congress. In addition to spending time in Washington, as I mentioned, I fly around the country. And I've spent time with Lou Dobbs in New York, talking about how he's made his focus on illegal immigration one of the best watched shows on CNN. I spent time in Texas with Senator John Cornyn, who was a Republican who was wrestling with some of those divisions I was talking about. In the spring, he was a guy trying to figure out where he should fall on this issue because he had very powerful and prominent supporters in the business community in Texas who very much wanted him to support a guest worker program and a legalization program for illegal immigrants. And on the other hand, he had conservative voters who were really, really outraged. And he was really, really on the spot. I remember one day during one of the committee hearings, he's on the Senate Judiciary Committee, a week before I did the interview. And Senator Specter happened to mention that he and Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts, the Democrat, that Cornyn and Kennedy were entering into some sort of discussions to try and come to an agreement. And everybody kind of looked around, and his office was inundated by calls from very, very angry supporters who said, how could you do this? In fact, I was sitting in his office waiting for the interview, and his receptionist was picking up the phone while I was there and saying, no, he's not going to make a deal, he's not going to make a deal. And it was, again, an example of kind of the tricky position that many Republicans have found themselves in. In the end, Senator Cornyn decided that he couldn't vote for the Senate bill, which would provide for the legalization of most illegal immigrants. I've also spent time, I mentioned these marches around the country, which you may have seen in the spring, writing about those. This was an unusual year on immigration in many respects, but some of these marches were among the largest the country has ever seen. We had more than 500,000 immigrants and their supporters marching in Los Angeles. We had hundreds of thousands in Washington, Chicago, Atlanta, all over the place. And many people hoped, I think at the time, many of the immigrant organizers at the time were speaking of a new movement, a new immigrant movement, a new social movement, maybe a new civil rights movement, based around this immigrant struggle. In recent weeks, I've spent time looking kind of what has happened to that movement. You may know that on Labor Day and in the days after Labor Day, immigrant groups tried to resurrect that kind of street activism. And in protests all around the country, they just drew many, many, many fewer people than they had expected. They had also anticipated in the spring that they would have a very big impact on these coming congressional elections and predicted that they would have 1 million new voters and 1 million new citizens who would have a real impact on the polls. And I remember very vividly in the spring there was quite a bit of nervousness among Republicans and Democrats who had questions about supporting legalization, just because even though Hispanics don't vote in huge numbers right now, they are the largest minority in the country and a potentially very powerful voting bloc, certainly in the future. But the immigrant organizers in recent weeks have acknowledged that they won't get those numbers. And there's been a lot of debate about whether or not this movement has fizzled and whether it will amount to more than just these enormous demonstrations that made history. And there's also been some debate now about how useful or not that they've been. Some folks say, maybe actually instead of pushing Congress in the direction that the immigrants had hoped, maybe it simply hardened the lines between groups that were already pretty polarized. There was certainly a lot of backlash against immigrants waving Mexican flags, for instance. And many blacks, for instance, were offended by or uneasy about the comparisons that people were making to the civil rights movement when they were talking about this immigrant movement. So on the side of immigrant activism, things are a little unclear at the moment. In Washington, in terms of legislation, things also a bit unclear. I guess what we can say for sure is that the difficult issues about what to do about the 11 or 12 million illegal immigrant programs and whether or not a guest worker program will be created, those issues won't be dealt with before the elections. In fact, this week, one of my colleagues is going to have to handle this because I'm here talking to you guys, but in Congress this week, the House and Senate are dealing with border security issues. Both houses have decided that those tough issues are too tough to handle right now. And the House in particular have decided, Republicans in the House in particular have decided that their constituents don't want any part of a legalization program which is viewed as amnesty. So the focus is much more on, last week the House passed legislation that would put 700 miles of fencing on the border with the U.S. and Mexico. The Senate is going to vote this week on the same thing, and along with a number of border security measures. Folks hope and say that these measures will tighten the border and stem the tide of illegal immigrants coming across. Whether or not that will happen or not is also unclear, because we've tried a lot of things over the past 15 or 16 years, and folks are still coming. And certainly if the current trends continue, the one thing I think that we can be certain about is that immigrants will still come, and that we will continue to wrestle with how to cope with them. The title of my speech mentioned global implications. And on that side of things, I think it's important to recognize that the United States is far from alone in wrestling with these kinds of issues. As a reporter for the New York Times, as has been mentioned, I spent a good deal of time working abroad in Russia, in Cuba, nearly 4 years in Southern Africa. I completed a master's degree in England and traveled all across Europe. And because I did my undergraduate degree in Spanish and in Caribbean studies, I've spent a great deal of time in that part of the world too, in Colombia, Mexico, Haiti, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, Cuba. And the question of immigration and immigrants is something that many, many, many countries are wrestling with. We've seen it probably most recently in these terror plots in England, where there is a painful, ongoing soul-searching about the integration of Muslim immigrants. And we saw it last year in France, where you may remember the riots, where Arab and African young people, many of them feeling disconnected from French society, burned cars and attacked police. But we've also seen it in places perhaps less familiar to us. In South Africa, for instance, which is the most prosperous economy in sub-Saharan Africa, thousands upon thousands of African immigrants from all across the continent are pouring into that country for the same reason many people come here, for jobs and for better educational opportunities. And there is an enormous feeling of resentment on the part of black South Africans who, in a country where, despite being the most prosperous in the continent, there's still high unemployment. People worry about many of the same things that people worry about here, about jobs, about opportunities, and about those scarce, precious things going to other people. And also in another place you might not have thought about is the Bahamas. The Bahamas, the island nation, has received in recent years many, many, many refugees from Haiti, a troubled island nation too that has been in a hard place for a long time. And in the Bahamas there is also this kind of wrestling with, on the one hand, wanting to help, on the other hand, with the question of, how many is too many? And so this is something that many, many countries are wrestling with, along with the United States. Now, I want to wrap up, so I'm hoping this will be a bit interactive. So think of your questions now. I want to wrap up talking to you a little bit about my own backstory and why I ended up being quite interested in this topic. Part of that is because I grew up in New York City, and that meant I lived in neighborhoods and went to school with kids from Germany, from Korea, from South Africa, from the Dominican Republic, from Israel. And I remember feeling kind of like, why am I one of the few people that speak only English? And it made me very interested in languages. And it's one of the reasons I started studying Spanish in junior high school and continued on in my university studies. And it was also one of the reasons that drew me to Florida. And I was in Florida in 1994 when the Cuban and Haitian rafter crisis happened, and thousands upon thousands of people took to the seas in tiny little rafts, tires, anything, and saw that happening. And the other reason that I'm interested in the topic is because, like almost everyone here, aside from Native Americans, I have my own immigrant story. On one side of my family, my father is from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, descendant of African slaves brought to the South. And his family moved north along with many, many blacks in the 50s, 40s, 50s, 30s, 40s, 50s. They were tobacco factory workers who also tried to start a union, got blacklisted, so moved to New York. On the other side of the family, my mother's side, they're from the Caribbean, which is where my mother was born. And they ended up in New York too. And so one of my very big interests is about the relationship between long-time Americans and foreign-born Americans, because I've seen that in my own family, and in New York City. And because of my background, I'm also very interested in the relationship between black Americans and black immigrants. And New York City is a very good example of where you see that happening, where you have a large community of blacks from the South people who have been here for hundreds of years and their descendants, as well as a huge population of Caribbean Americans, as well as families from Africa. And so all of that informs my interest in the subject. And so with that, I know everyone has to go to class at 3. I'm still on Eastern time in my watch here. I'm hoping that you'll have some questions, and I thank you for your time. Is there someone who will, or just no? Okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you have seen any similarities or bad sentiments that the fence with Mexico might cause when compared to the Berlin Wall.
You know, it really depends on who you ask. Certainly in Latin America, when the idea of the fence was first posited by the House of Representatives in December, there was a lot of bad feelings and a lot of comparisons made by presidents in South America about that kind of thing. And an enormous opposition to that. And in some quarters, some concern about how that might affect our diplomatic relations with some of those countries. On the other hand, there are folks who feel very, very strongly that this is what we need to do, and if we can't secure our borders, what kind of nation are we? If a nation can't control its boundaries, then how can it call itself a nation? So there's a lot of division on that point.
Have the debates in Washington considered doing any negotiations with the Mexican government to ease the transition of immigrants into the United States?
You know, there are often talks about migration is one of the issues that is of great interest to both countries, and there's a recognition that, you know, the two countries have to kind of work together to deal with that. Mexico has very much wanted a legalization agreement with the United States and pushed very hard for that. In fact, even before 9/11, it seemed actually like they were very close. But after 9/11, kind of everything changed. And Mexico has, the talks still are ongoing, but much more of the focus has been internally in terms of U.S. policy and U.S. lawmakers. Okay. The green.
Many local and county governments have made their own decisions on this issue because the federal government hasn't really been able to do that. What are the implications of these local decisions for a national problem?
That is really happening a ton. And I think that in the spring when I was writing about this, well, as of earlier this year, as of February of this year, I think 42 states had introduced something like 368 bills on immigration, because there's a great deal of frustration both at the state level and at the local level that the federal government hasn't resolved this issue. And so you have a furious debate with some states and localities passing legislation to help, to ease the transition for immigrants, folks allowing illegal immigrants to go to college or benefit from in-state tuition, and then on the other side, too, folks making it much tougher, folks viewing illegal immigrants as lawbreakers. That has been one of the reasons that folks arguing that the federal government needs to do something, often point to. They say, look, we're, in the absence of federal legislation, we're developing a kind of hodgepodge of all kinds of policies. And don't we need a kind of overarching national policy? And almost everyone agrees that we do, but just how to get there is really the difficulty.
What do you feel are some of the probable outcomes of this congressional debate?
It's really hard to say where this is going. There are some people who think that perhaps after the elections in November and before this Congress ends its term, that without the pressure of elections, members of Congress can come back and hammer out a deal. There are people who think we'll just be in this kind of limbo state for a long time until next year when maybe Congress will try and take it up again. I think almost regardless of where people stand on the issue, whether they support granting legal status to illegal immigrants or they really oppose it, almost everyone agrees that the current system isn't working. But whether or not we as a nation are going to come to some solution with how to fix that, still remains really uncertain.
One of the largest criticisms is that the inflow of illegal immigrants has increased crime rates. I was interested in your experience in Atkinson in Georgia, if they had seen any increase in crime rate or any other negative social consequences of that immigration.
There's a big debate about that, and you do hear that all over the country. In fact, I spoke to the county seat in Atkinson is Pearson. The Pearson police chief says, no problem. The county sheriff says, enormous problems. They both agree that the problem that they both agree that they've seen is folks driving without licenses, and that that has been, and insurance, and that has been a real problem in terms of accidents and that kind of thing. But there is division within that county about how much of a problem in terms of crime immigrants are posing. Yes, the young lady there.
Have you written any books, or do you just have news articles?
My father would be very sad to hear me say this, though he knows it's true. I have not written any books yet. I'm 39, so there's still time. No, my day job is writing for the New York Times, and it fills much of my days. I'm also the mother of a little boy who will be 2 in December, so there's not much time for much else beyond that.
Yes, as Washington embarks in these debates, are they considering the great contributions of immigrants, both documented and undocumented, as they think of solutions to this issue?
Very much so. I mean, I think almost all across this debate, and again, regardless of where people stand on the debate, people say, even those who oppose legalizing, say that we can't ignore the enormous contribution that immigrants have made and continue to make. And even those who are opposed to legalizing illegal immigrants, almost everyone acknowledges that of the 11 to 12 million people who are here, almost everybody's working. I mean, there's no debate that people are here just hanging out. People are here working. And certainly the business community, as much as they can, makes it very clear that we need these people. So there is that recognition, but there is also an argument that folks make that there are burdens that particularly illegal immigrants make. And so they argue that point as strenuously as those who argue about the benefits that we gain from immigration. So you in Washington, you hear both sides argued pretty vociferously, and even those who argue about the drain that they describe illegal immigration causing always say, but wait, I'm not saying that immigration hasn't been great for this country. So that is always pointed out. All the way in the back.
Considering your personal background, what are your personal views on immigration? What's your solution?
You know what? People always ask me that. In newspapers, we have folks who write editorials and we have folks who write columns. And those folks can go around saying, I hate this color brown and that really makes me angry. But what I do is write about the news in different perspectives. So in my articles, what I think really doesn't matter. What I do is try and speak to and understand the arguments of folks on all sides of the issue. And sometimes that's a difficult thing for people to understand or believe that we can actually do. There are often times, because the New York Times has a liberal editorial standpoint. Our editorial board has a liberal viewpoint that they propound very often in their editorials. When I go around the country and I interview conservatives on immigration, there are many, many times people say to me, well, why should I talk to you? I know what I say won't appear in the paper. And I say, you know, give me a chance. I tell you, that's what I do. I wouldn't be talking to you if it didn't matter. And I can't tell you how many times I get calls and emails from people saying, wow, I didn't think the New York Times would publish that. I was like, I did tell you. If it's relevant, we'll publish that. In terms of a solution, though, I think it's really a difficult question. I mean, I think what people mostly agree would be important elements of a solution is, in terms of enforcement, we have never had a system of worksite enforcement that really works. The big draw for migrants to come is that there are jobs for them to fill, but there's never been any kind of incentive or push for, or help for businesses to try and figure out who's here legally or not, and people think that should be toughened up. There's also, I think, a sense among many people that there needs to be a legal framework for foreign workers to come and go, because there is a need for the labor. And that if there was a legal mechanism, a guest worker program of some sort, that allowed people to come for 2 to 5 years and then go home, that then you wouldn't have this kind of illegal situation. And then there are those, the big debate, of course, is about what to do with the people who are already here. And, you know, some people say the easiest thing is, oh, these people are here working, let's grant them legal status. And then people say, well, we can't reward those people. Why should we reward those people? So there are different elements to a solution to this problem, but I don't know that there's really any consensus on what those elements are. Yes?
I was wondering if Congress is debating right now racial issues to do with immigration, such as the Brown Pride movements and race wars in the schools, or if there's issues we're having now.
Not so much. I mean, there's discussion about assimilation sometimes. People sometimes, when people look at the current wave of immigrants and the previous large wave, you know, people talk about assimilation and whether or not the current waves of immigrants will assimilate in the same way that the Europeans have. And there's some great debate and discussion about that. People talk about language and immigrants holding on to language more. People who are concerned about those kinds of discussions are worried that questions of assimilation are occurring now with particular urgency because it's a largely brown population that we're talking about. Some people do talk about, and I've certainly written about, the concerns among blacks and the concerns about competition among blacks and immigrants, and whether or not there are, you know, this is going to create greater tensions between them, particularly when people are considering a guest worker program, which would bring kind of hundreds of thousands of folks every year, and about the concern for competition over low-wage jobs. But those are kinds of discussions that are have been happening around kind of the boundaries of the debate. It's not something that's been enormously prominent on Capitol Hill.
With your experiences, how do you think race has affected the people's view on their political views in this issue? Like, how has race affected?
As I mentioned before, I mean, it's one of these things where, you know, some folks say, advocates for immigrants sometimes argue that opponents to legalization are grounded in racism. You know, they're uncomfortable with, whereas people were more comfortable with the idea of Europeans, they are less comfortable with the idea of Latin Americans or Asians or Africans coming to the country. As I mentioned, there are these discussions in the black community too, with some concerns among blacks about how good this will be, or does this push blacks further back, and discussions about trying to build better connections and communication between blacks here and new arrivals. It's kind of it's one of these subtext kinds of things. It's not something that's discussed in terms of the actual debate in Capitol Hill. But some of you may have heard about a book that an academic by the name of Samuel Huntington wrote. I guess it came out in 2004, where just this whole question of assimilation again, and whether or not this new wave of immigrants would assimilate or change America in ways that people perhaps would not like. And again, a lot of people associated with those kinds of arguments with race-based arguments.
Just wondering, in your travels around the country, you described that you were trying to get a wide variety of opinions and backgrounds in terms of what you describe in your writing. How difficult have you found it to actually talk to those that would be termed illegal immigrants? Have they been willing to speak to you? Have you had a hard time actually getting their point of view across as opposed to other interest groups?
I speak Spanish, which helps. But sometimes, people are nervous, and it sometimes can be, what's difficult is not necessarily talking to people. What's difficult is sometimes people don't want their names in the paper, people don't want to be photographed. I also, which was not part of my discussion today, but I also did quite a bit of work after 9/11 on the Arab and Muslim community. And there was a great amount of fear and concern among people who were citizens and living here legally, as well as those who did not, about speaking, because out of fear that they would be targeted. So people are willing to talk. People are kind of increasingly concerned about appearing in a public way in the newspaper.
The question has to do with this new wave of, after 9/11, we're becoming more aware of the Arab and Muslim population, and then with the immigration of Mexicans and Hispanics coming up, how does this change the general state of race relations these days in these communities that you visited? For example, in the South, has this new wave of immigration affected the way that the white and black communities get along together? That's the question.
Well, in fact, one of my very next stories on my little community in Georgia is about that subject. It is changing in the South kind of the established racial dynamics because, even if blacks and whites didn't always get along, there was often a kind of understanding. And this has kind of thrown a whole new dimension kind of to these communities. And it's very, very complicated. Some whites in the business community increasingly prefer Hispanic workers because they feel like they work harder. Often they work for less too, but they argue that they have a better work ethic than black workers do. Some whites and blacks though are aligning together and saying no immigrants at all. This is enough. Too many. Send them back. You have some blacks. Because the black perspective sometimes varies too along class lines. Folks who are in a position who are not direct competition, folks who may be more educated or more prosperous, often see similarities and room for alliances with the new immigrant communities. And so you see in some places among black Southerners respect and saying, wow, these folks came here and look, they're really moving up. And, in the political kind of world in a southern town, maybe we can have some political alliances here. But, and then you also have black workers who feel like, whites are favoring Hispanics and that Hispanics are taking jobs. So it's become a very, very complicated portrait there. And We shouldn't forget also kind of the views of the immigrants themselves who are kind of thrust into this situation. And they have very interesting and complicated views too, with some of them feeling some kinship with blacks because of a shared sense of discrimination that they experience, and some sense of the history of the South. But some immigrants too have come to the U.S. with having heard, well, from Mexico, for instance, where there is not very much of a black population, and what they know about blacks comes from news accounts, and they, hear about crime and violence and in urban communities, and they come anxious and worried and wanting to distance themselves. So it's a very complicated picture, but it is very much changing the situation on the ground. Yes.
We've witnessed a lot of protests from the Hispanic community in this past month. What do you think was the impact of such protests in Washington as the issues being trying to be resolved?
There's a lot of debate about that. Some people initially thought that it would really push Congress to favor legislation that would favor immigrants. Some people, certainly some of folks who think like the president does. I mean, certainly there are folks like Karl Rove and strategists in the Republican Party who see immigrants in the Hispanic community in particular as a growing and powerful constituency that is kind of up for grabs, and that the Republican Party should kind of capture this group and not leave them to the Democrats. So folks like that saw that and thought, oh, good Lord, and now we have these voter security stuff, we're going to alienate these potential voters. On the other hand, as I mentioned, there are others in the Republican Party and in the Democratic Party too, in the South particularly, who felt this is too much. Where is this country going to, where illegal immigrants are taking to the streets and demanding that our Congress change something? Who are they to say that? So, I guess in November we might get some sense of whether or not folks really, something comes of this in a way that actually makes significant political change. And some folks are saying actually not November, maybe 2008, but it's very unclear right now. Yes?
How often do you publish, and where can we find your work in times?
It really depends. Like sometimes, like when Congress is very busy, on this, I'll write every day. Last week I had a story when the House approved the fence, 700 miles of fence. Like I said, one of my colleagues is sort of bitterly shouldering my work this week while I'm here. And I'm supposed to say that Carl Hulse, our chief correspondent, is a wonderful man, and he is, and talented, and should be paid more. But sometimes, like for instance, the articles I've been writing about in the South, I've spent, for one story, I've taken, say, 8 trips to the community and spent 3 weeks writing. So, but if you go to the website nytimes.com and punch in Swarns, you would see, get a sense of what I've been writing.
I was wondering, you talked a little bit about the relations between the U.S. and Mexican government prior to 9/11. I was wondering, in the congressional debates now, is there any talk? When we, looking at literature, there's any social literature. There's a lot on the effects on Mexican communities specifically. How the varying effects there. Is there any? Does that ever enter the debate at all?
It does. I mean, and some folks who argue for a guest worker program that would be a time-limited one that would give workers, say, 2 to 5 years, and then they'd have to go home and then apply again for a 2 to 5 year period, argue that that would be better than just saying people could come and, be put on a path to citizenship here, because it would help Mexico. That, and what has happened to Mexico. Mexico has in some ways gained enormously from the migration because, folks send money back. And I can't say, it's the number 2 or 3 source of income for the country that is the money that comes back from migrants here, and I think oil is their primary revenue gainer. So on the one hand, Mexico gains enormously from the migrants here who are here, and for that reason they have very much wanted some sort of normalized situation. On the other hand, there are towns in Mexico now where literally there are old people and children because the workers have all left. And because the government has tightened the border to a certain extent, people don't go back in the way that they would have once before. So there have been arguments made that a guest worker program that was limited would kind of restore that kind of what they called circular migration, where people would come and work, then go home and invest their earnings in businesses or property or whatever, and give something back to Mexico. So that has been discussed there.
Do one more question.
Okay. I'm told one more question, so let's see. Have you asked a question? Yes.
No.
Okay.
Like, I've grown up alongside of many illegal immigrants who came here in the 90s as young children, and so now they're becoming adults, and they're in this kind of limbo state where they can't really seek higher education. Have they been considered in Congress or anything?
Yes, they're part of the Senate legislation was something called the DREAM Act, which people may have heard, which was meant to deal with illegal immigrants, young people who have lived here for a long period of time. I mean, just to such an extent that really they don't know their home countries, but who are very successful in their academics. To give them an opportunity to legalize their status and to go to school, so that we can then benefit from them, their knowledge and their success. But that is stalled along with a lot of the other immigration legislation right now. I think I've been told that's it. I want to thank you very much for coming.